It had all seemed so perfect. Ethan had been searching for a new job for months, sending out dozens of applications with little success. But then, he received an email from Veritas Technologies, a company known for its cutting-edge innovations. The subject line read, "Job interview confirmation, data analyst position." Ethan couldn't believe his luck. Veritas Technologies had been his dream company. He had researched them extensively, reading about their advancements in AI, machine learning, and data analysis. He was certain this was the opportunity that could change his life. On the morning of the interview, Ethan dressed in his best suit, making sure every detail was perfect. He arrived early at their sleek, glass-paneled office building, feeling a rush of excitement and nerves. As he walked through the doors, a sleek, modern reception area greeted him. The receptionist, a woman with sharp features and an efficient air, checked him in and directed him to a waiting area. The office was minimalist but elegant. Large plants were placed in every corner, and the soft hum of background music filled the space. Ethan sat down, running his fingers nervously over his resume. He glanced around at the other applicants sitting nearby. They all appeared just as nervous as he was, flipping through their notes or typing away on their phones. A few minutes later, a man in his mid-40s appeared from behind a set of glass doors. He was tall and impeccably dressed, wearing a dark suit with a crisp white shirt. His short salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his sharp blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him. He smiled at the applicants, though it seemed more like a polite gesture than anything genuine. "Ethan Miller?" the man called. Ethan stood up quickly, adjusting his tie as he approached the interviewer. "Yes, that's me." "Come right in," the man said, leading Ethan through the glass doors into a small but sophisticated conference room. A large wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by comfortable chairs. The interviewer motioned for him to sit at the far side of the table. "Thanks for coming in today, Ethan," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "My name is Richard Hayes. I'll be conducting your interview." "Thank you for having me," Ethan replied, still trying to steady his nerves. Richard sat down across from him, placing a tablet on the table. The device lit up, displaying Ethan's resume and a few notes that Ethan had never seen before. It seemed odd, but Ethan didn't think too much of it. "Let's get started," Richard said, tapping on the tablet screen. "I see you've been working at Datacorp for the last 3 years. How would you describe your experience there?" Ethan felt a wave of relief. This was the type of question he was prepared for. He launched into a well-practiced answer, talking about his experience with data analysis, his work on several high-profile projects, and his passion for technology. Richard listened intently, nodding occasionally, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at Ethan. It was as if he was scrutinizing him more than just for the content of his answer. His gaze seemed to pierce through him, as if he were studying every movement, every twitch of Ethan's face. "Very good," Richard said after a moment, tapping his tablet again. "But I see you left your previous job at Nexus Consulting rather abruptly. What happened there?" Ethan froze. The mention of Nexus Consulting was a surprise. He had worked there for a short period of time, just a few months after graduating, but he had left due to personal reasons. He had never mentioned it on his resume, choosing instead to focus on his longer tenure at Datacorp. I'm not sure what you mean," Ethan stammered. "I never worked at Nexus Consulting." Richard didn't flinch. "According to our records, you did. You were there for 4 months, just after finishing your degree. It seems to have been a difficult transition. Could you tell me why you left so quickly?" Ethan's heart began to race. How could he possibly know this? He had never shared any details about his brief stint at Nexus Consulting with anyone at Veritas Technologies. The experience had been unremarkable, and he had left on his own terms. Yet, Richard was asking about it like it was something they had discussed in detail. I don't understand, Ethan managed, trying to steady his breathing. Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. It's fine, I understand. Let's move on. But the question lingered in the air, and Ethan could feel his pulse quickening. Richard was already tapping away at his tablet, as if to move on to the next part of the interview. Ethan was too rattled to focus on anything else. It felt as if the conversation had taken a strange turn. Tell me, Ethan, Richard continued, his voice smooth but with a sharp edge. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely out of control? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew? The question caught Ethan off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing he expected in a job interview. He hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was this some kind of psychological test? Richard's eyes remained locked on him, as though he were waiting for the answer to reveal something deeper. Ethan swallowed hard. I don't think so. Richard didn't respond immediately. He just nodded and typed something into his tablet. Interesting. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had never been in an interview quite like this before. The questions seemed too personal, too invasive, and the way Richard was speaking was starting to feel more like an interrogation than a job interview. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Ethan tried to push the unease aside, but the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if Richard wasn't just asking about his qualifications. He was trying to uncover something about Ethan that he didn't want to reveal. As the interview continued, Richard's questions grew more unsettling. He asked about Ethan's family, his childhood, even about his most embarrassing moments. Every answer Ethan gave seemed to fuel more questions, each one more personal than the last. Tell me, Ethan, Richard said, his voice calm but forceful. What is your biggest fear? What keeps you up at night? Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His thoughts flashed to his childhood, to the things that had haunted him for years. The isolation, the feeling that he was always being watched, like there was something lurking just out of sight. He didn't want to say it aloud. Not here. Not now. I'm not sure, he muttered, looking down at the table. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You don't know? You sure about that? Ethan's heart raced. The room seemed to close in on him. Richard's eyes were too intense, his presence too commanding. He could feel the walls pressing in around him, and the sensation of being trapped began to sink in. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body felt frozen in place. As if sensing his growing discomfort, Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Let's take a break. You must be tired. Ethan was barely aware of his own legs as he stood up. He felt lightheaded, disoriented, as if everything around him was starting to blur. Richard's voice echoed in his mind, the questions still spinning in his head. Something wasn't right. Ethan knew it now, but it was too late. He had already crossed the threshold, and he was no longer sure whether he wanted the job or whether he wanted to escape. Ethan stepped out of the conference room, his mind still spinning. Richard had guided him toward the waiting area, but the conversation kept echoing in his thoughts. Something about the way Richard spoke, the questions he asked, felt wrong. Every word seemed calculated, deliberate, as if it was leading somewhere he couldn't yet see. The receptionist, who had remained silent the entire time, glanced up as Ethan approached. She gave him a brief, impersonal smile, but said nothing. Ethan felt her eyes follow him as he passed her, the unsettling feeling growing stronger by the second. He reached the elevator, his hand shaking as he pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, the small space feeling suffocating. He pressed the button for the lobby and watched the floor numbers change with each passing second. The hum of the elevator felt louder now, the air thick with tension. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The eyes of everyone in the building seemed to be on him. Dot. When the elevator doors opened, Ethan stepped out into the lobby, where the receptionist was now engaged in a quiet conversation with someone he didn't recognize. He quickly made his way to the exit, but as his hand reached for the door, he heard a voice call his name. Ethan. He turned around, his heart leaping into his throat. Richard stood there, a calm expression on his face, though his eyes were colder than before. "One more thing," Richard said, stepping toward him. "We'll let you know about the position in the next few days, but I'd like to suggest something in the meantime." Ethan raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard's gaze hardened slightly. "You've mentioned your interest in AI development in your resume. I think you could be a perfect fit for a special project we're working on." He glanced toward the receptionist who was still watching them, then back to Ethan. "You'll hear from us soon. I think you'll be quite impressed with what we have in store." Ethan stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Was this some kind of test? Or was he missing something? Richard smiled faintly, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. "Don't worry. You'll understand soon enough." With that, Richard turned and walked back toward the conference rooms, leaving Ethan standing by the door, his mind racing. He had no idea what that cryptic remark meant, but something told him that he didn't want to find out. For the next few days, Ethan tried to go about his normal life, but the interview haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about the odd questions Richard had asked. More than that, he couldn't shake the sense that he was being followed. It was subtle, a lingering feeling, but it was there, like someone was always just behind him, watching from the corner of his eye. He went to work, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, but his attention kept wandering. Every time he checked his email, he found himself holding his breath, hoping for a message from Veritas Technologies. But there was nothing. His phone remained silent. The longer he waited, the more his anxiety grew. 2 days after the interview, Ethan was at home, sitting on the couch with his laptop, when he received a notification. An email from Veritas Technologies. His hands shook as he opened it. The subject line read, "Your application. Further instructions." It wasn't the formal professional response he had expected. It was brief and unsettling. "Ethan, we appreciate your interest in the data analyst position at Veritas Technologies. After careful review, we've decided to move forward with your application. However, before we proceed, we need to ask you a few more questions. Please visit the link below at your earliest convenience. It's crucial that you complete the questionnaire fully and without hesitation. The results will guide our next steps." Secure link. Ethan stared at the screen, his stomach sinking. He hadn't expected to hear back so soon, but the message felt wrong. The language was too impersonal, too cold. The mention of a questionnaire made his skin crawl. It was like they were conducting some sort of experiment on him. He hesitated, but his curiosity won out. He clicked the link. The page that opened was simple. There was a series of questions, personal questions, each one more intrusive than the last. 1. What is your deepest fear? 2. When did you last lie? 3. Have you ever had the feeling that someone is watching you, even when you're alone? 4. Have you ever regretted a decision you made? 5. Do you trust yourself? Ethan's heart pounded as he read the questions. It felt like a psychological test, not a job interview. He thought about quitting right then and there, but something kept him going. He filled in the answers mechanically, trying not to let his unease show. As he finished the last question, a new prompt appeared. "Thank you for your time. Please stand by. We will reach out soon with further instructions." Ethan closed the laptop, his hands trembling. He had to get out of the house. He couldn't sit there any longer, trapped in the suffocating atmosphere that had settled over him. He needed to clear his head, to escape whatever this was. He grabbed his jacket and left, not caring where he went, just needing to get away from the house. As he walked through the quiet streets, he felt the familiar creeping sensation again. Someone was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no one there. He tried to shake it off, but the unease only grew. Later that night, as Ethan was lying in bed, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. His heart skipped a beat as he grabbed it. A notification from Veritas Technologies. His hands shook as he opened the message. It was a video file titled "Ethan's Future." The video played automatically. In the dim light of the screen, Ethan saw himself, sitting in the same chair he had been in during the interview. Richard's voice came through the speaker, but it wasn't from the interview. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice smooth and calm. "I hope you're doing well. We've been monitoring your progress, and I think you'll find that we've made an interesting discovery." The screen flickered for a moment, then showed footage of Ethan's apartment, taken from a camera inside his living room. His heart raced as he realized they had been watching him. Richard's voice continued. "I think we're ready to move forward. We've been preparing you for something bigger. Don't worry, Ethan. You're almost ready." The screen went black. Ethan dropped the phone, his body numb with terror. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, but his limbs felt like lead. He had crossed a line. He had opened the door to something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The company wasn't just hiring him. They were watching him, studying him, preparing him for something. He didn't understand, and now there was no turning back. Ethan's mind raced as he stared at his phone, the dark screen reflecting his terror-stricken face. Richard's voice echoed in his ears, sending a chill through his entire body. "We've been monitoring your progress, preparing you for something bigger." The words swirled around him like a haunting refrain, each syllable digging deeper into his sense of dread. He couldn't sit still. He grabbed his phone again, desperate to replay the video, to somehow make sense of it. But the file was gone. Just like that, it had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the unsettling aftertaste of what he had seen. He couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest, the anxiety suffocating him. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion, fear, and disbelief. Why was he being watched? What had he gotten himself into? The feeling of being surveilled had grown stronger in the days after his interview. Ethan had brushed it off as paranoia, until now. The video had confirmed his worst fears. He wasn't just a candidate for a job. He was a subject in some twisted experiment, and he had no idea how deep it went. Ethan's hands trembled as he sat back down on the couch, staring out of the window into the dark night. The streets below were empty, the world outside seemingly oblivious to the storm of chaos inside his mind. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That a company had been spying on him? That they knew things about his past that he had never shared? No, he couldn't do that. He would look crazy. He had no evidence, only the vague feeling that he was being watched and the disturbing video that had appeared on his phone. Desperately, he tried to shake off the fear. He had to get a grip. This couldn't be real, not in the way he was thinking. He had to keep calm. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But as he did, his eyes fell on the small envelope lying on the coffee table. It was the same size and shape as a standard letter. He didn't remember receiving it, but there it was, neatly placed in front of him. The envelope was unmarked, with no return address, no sign of where it had come from. His pulse quickened. He grabbed it, carefully tearing it open, half expecting something worse. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with just a few lines typed in black ink. Ethan, we've been following your progress, and we're pleased with what we've seen. The next phase begins soon. Be prepared. You will be contacted. The note was short, cryptic, and signed only with the letter R. Ethan's stomach twisted in knots. Richard. This was him. The company, Veritas Technologies, was not just interested in his skills. They were manipulating him, pulling him into something far darker than a simple job offer. What kind of company did this? What were they planning? Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the door. Ethan froze. He hadn't expected visitors. He looked around, the apartment suddenly feeling far too small, as though the walls were closing in. He went to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent. His heart raced. He reached for the doorknob, but his hand hesitated just before it touched the cool metal. Should he open it? What if this was just another part of the game? What if opening the door was exactly what they wanted? Ethan's breath came faster as panic began to overwhelm him. He couldn't think straight. The knock came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of the envelope being slid under the door. He stepped back, heart pounding. He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to read anything else. But his curiosity was too strong, his mind consumed by the need to understand. Slowly, he knelt down, eyes scanning the thin envelope now lying on the floor. With trembling hands, he picked it up and carefully opened it. Inside was another sheet of paper, the same font, but the message was different. Ethan, you've come this far. There's no turning back now. The final test awaits. Meet us at the coordinates. We'll be expecting you. Again, it was signed with the letter R. Ethan's mind whirled. The final test? What test? Where? Why was this happening to him? There was no address, no clue as to what he was supposed to do. But somehow, deep down, he knew that this was it. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Veritas Technologies wasn't just offering him a job, they were preparing him for something he couldn't yet comprehend. Terror gripped him, but alongside it, there was a surge of determination. He couldn't let this happen to him. He couldn't let them control him any longer. He needed answers. He had to confront Richard. He had to find out what was going on before it was too late. With shaking hands, Ethan grabbed his jacket again. This time, he wasn't running away. This time, he was going to face it head on. He stepped out into the night, his footsteps quickening as he made his way toward the unknown. The air felt colder now, heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. As he walked, the familiar feeling of being watched returned. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, but the street was empty. He tried to shake the sensation off, but it was there, lingering, watching, waiting for him to make his next move. By the time he reached the coordinates, the feeling was unbearable. The place was an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The doors were slightly ajar, a dim light glowing from within. He stood there for a moment, heart hammering in his chest, before stepping forward. The door creaked as it opened, and as he entered, he was met with silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and he found himself face to face with Richard Hayes. The same cold, calculating gaze, the same unsettling smile. "You came," Richard said, his voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight. "I knew you would. I always knew you would." Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. "What is this? What do you want from me?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing to the room behind him. The walls were lined with screens, showing live footage of Ethan, his every move, his every action, every moment of his life, captured by hidden cameras. "This is what you've been a part of, Ethan," Richard said, his voice low and measured. "You were never just an applicant. You were chosen. We've been preparing you for something much greater than a job interview." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the screens, the realization crashing over him. This wasn't a job. It was an experiment. He was the subject. Richard stepped forward, his smile widening. "Welcome to Veritas Technologies, Ethan. Welcome to your new life." And in that moment, Ethan understood. There was no escape, no turning back. He had been chosen. And now, there was nothing left but to face whatever came next. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow and erratic. The room around him, dimly lit by the flickering monitors, seemed to close in as he faced Richard. The air felt thick, suffocating. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. Richard stood calmly before him, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "You've done well, Ethan," he said, a chilling smile curling on his lips. "You've followed our instructions to the letter. And now, it's time for the final phase." Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. He could feel his pulse racing as he glanced around the room. The monitors displayed unsettling images, his own face, his own body, moments of his life captured and dissected for reasons he couldn't comprehend. The feeling of being watched, of being controlled, overwhelmed him. His thoughts were scattered, racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. He had already been caught. Richard stepped closer, his presence towering over Ethan. "Veritas Technologies is not just a company," he continued. "It's an organization built on something far greater than any of the research you could ever imagine. We don't just study technology, Ethan. We study humanity. We evolve it. You've been part of our experiment from the beginning." The truth hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just a candidate for a job. He wasn't even just a subject in a psychological experiment. No, what they had done to him was far worse. What he had signed up for, the interview, the job offer, was nothing more than a cover for something far darker. Richard's voice was icy, filled with an unsettling calmness. "You see, Ethan, we've been conducting biological experiments on you, monitoring your body's responses to various stimuli, modifying it, adjusting the chemical and neurological pathways in your brain. All of this, leading up to this moment." Ethan's stomach churned, nausea rising in his throat. What have you done to me?" he gasped, his voice trembling with fear. Richard's eyes glinted with satisfaction. "We've been conditioning you, Ethan, preparing your body for a series of trials. Each test, each adjustment brings us closer to understanding what it takes to evolve the human form, to make it stronger, more resilient, to break the limits of mortality." Ethan stumbled back, his body suddenly feeling heavy, as if gravity itself was pressing down on him. A pain, sharp and searing, shot through his chest. He grasped at his ribs, gasping for air. The changes they had made to him, the experiments, they had altered him on a cellular level. He could feel it. It was all too much. His body wasn't his own anymore. Everything you've experienced, the interviews, the tests, even the videos we showed you, was part of our research. Every moment was calculated, Ethan, Richard said, his voice now a whisper, filled with sick pride. Every test designed to push your limits. You were chosen for this. Chosen to become part of something much greater. Ethan's vision blurred. His heart felt as though it was about to explode. The pressure in his chest intensified, and his breathing became more ragged. The room around him seemed to twist and contort, the monitors flashing images of his own body, twitching and distorting as if they were mocking him. I can't breathe," Ethan gasped, his voice barely audible. His body was rebelling against the modifications they had made to him. The experiment was too much. The pain was unbearable, his heart racing uncontrollably, his lungs desperate for air that wouldn't come. Richard didn't seem to care. He merely stood there, watching, as Ethan's body began to convulse, his face contorting in agony. You knew the risks, Ethan. This was always going to happen. We've pushed you beyond human limits. You were never meant to survive this. Ethan's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the cold, hard floor. His body shook violently, every muscle in his frame screaming with pain, every nerve on fire. His mind was slipping away, his consciousness fading, as the horrific experiment they had subjected him to reached its brutal climax. The last thing Ethan saw before his vision went black was Richard's smiling face, a twisted satisfaction in his eyes. Rest now, Ethan. You were a valuable subject. You've completed your part. Ethan's body lay still on the cold floor, his breath no longer coming. The monitors continued to flicker, displaying footage of Ethan's final moments as Richard stood over him, a faint smile still playing at the corners of his lips. The experiment had been a success, in one cruel and tragic sense. Ethan had pushed the boundaries of human endurance, and in the end, he had broken. But for Richard and Veritas Technologies, this was only the beginning. Ethan had been the first to undergo this experiment. There would be others, more candidates, more subjects, ready to push the limits of humanity further than anyone could imagine. And Ethan? He was just the first casualty in their quest for perfection.